This is Patrick Dolans with the second presentation focusing on market activity. In this presentation, we're going to take the demand determinants that were introduced in the last presentation, and we're going to apply them graphically. I won't go back through the 5 determinants of demand, but they're identified here to remind you, and if you need to review them, of course you can review the earlier presentation. As we think about the influence that these demand determinants have on our graph of a demand curve, we need to be able to think about change in 2 broad categories. One category of thinking about change refers to what's known as an endogenous change. Endogenous change refers to change that comes from inside the model. It's change that the model is designed to explain. The second category of change is known as exogenous change. Exogenous change comes from outside or beyond the scope of the model. Exogenous change is not the sort of change that the model was ever intended to explain, but rather the model simply takes it as given. One way to help you remember this distinction is that endogenous sounds like internal and focuses on change within. Exogenous sounds like external and focuses on change from the outside. Now we're going to consider the model that we presented in the last presentation. That is to say, my demand for movie tickets. I want you to think back to the demand schedule that we constructed with numerical values and the demand curve that came out of that demand schedule. Look closely at the information that you have to work with here. What is it that this model of a demand curve is attempting to explain? What are the parameters within the model that are allowed to vary or change and still be contained within our explanation? And what's beyond the scope of this model? As you start to grapple with and answer those questions, you're confronted by what economists refer to as movement versus shift. The remainder of this presentation will focus on these 2 categories of change that take place with respect to our model of demand. Let's focus on them each in turn. First, we'll talk about movement along a curve. When we refer to movement along a curve, we're talking about a situation where the price of a good or service has changed. Because the price has changed, and because we're going to encounter a movement along a demand curve, economists refer to this as, quote, a change in the quantity demanded, unquote. This is one of those jargon places where if you use different language, you convey a message that you may not intend. What can we say about other factors if we're trying to model a price change? Other factors, in particular, being the determinants of demand. Well, as you may recall from the prior presentation, the determinants of demand, all those other factors, were assumed to hold still, or to remain constant, or to not change. Therefore, when we're talking about a movement along a demand curve, we assume that the ceteris paribus assumption holds. We assume that the assumption is valid. Finally, what kind of a change does this describe? Is this an endogenous change or an exogenous change? That is to say, if the price of movie tickets went from $16 to $12 and all other factors that matter held still, does the model account for what would happen next, or is it beyond the scope of the model to explain the consequence? Hopefully you can recognize that our model is designed precisely for exploring the change in price from $16 to $12, and therefore this would refer to an endogenous or internal change. Let's talk about the second category. The second category is known as a shift in a curve. When we refer to a shift in the curve, we are more specifically thinking in terms of one of the determinants that were assumed to hold still, one of those determinants actually changing. When economists are describing a shift in a curve, we use the phrase, quote, a change in demand, unquote. Once again, it's a little jargony, but you want to be careful that you use the jargon correctly. If in your head you're imagining a movement along a curve, and you say it was a change in demand, then in fact your jargon choice has conveyed a very different picture for anyone who understands economics. Just be careful with the jargon. If one of the determinants of demand changed, let's say my income changed, or let's say my expectations of the future changed, or let's say my tastes and preferences changed, to just give 3 possible examples. If one of the determinants changed, what would we say about all other things being equal? Well, obviously in this case, the ceteris paribus assumption has been broken or violated. That is to say, ceteris paribus does not hold. When ceteris paribus is broken, we get an entirely new demand curve. Now, typically, we can use the determinants to predict where that new demand curve is likely to reside, at least in general terms. So, for instance, if my income increases dramatically, then my demand for movie tickets is likely to shift outward, away from the origin, and at every price, I'm likely to consume a higher quantity of the good or service. On the graph, even though the price remains at P star, my old income predicted that I would consume a level associated with the point referenced as A, but my new income would correspond to the point B on an entirely new demand curve. Why did we have to construct a new demand curve? Because ceteris paribus didn't hold. And as you can see at the bottom, the quantity demanded looks very different now that I have a brand new demand curve. Notice also that the underlying relationship between price and quantity, the so-called law of demand, that as prices fall, quantity demanded goes up, notice that that is preserved. It's still intact. It's just because one of the determinants has changed, the demand curve itself has to move. Spend some time reviewing the last 2 slides. If you understand the difference not only graphically between a movement along a demand curve versus a shift in a demand curve, but some of the underlying factors, that is to say, the 4 different ways that I've contrasted them here, then you will begin to understand how to work with supply and demand curves in a way that will be very useful in some of the work to come.